She said I couldn't enter unless I covered up. His voice cut across the pool deck like a blade, Officer Brian Hensley, with that smug tone that made even the lifeguard shift uncomfortably. He wasn't a cop, not really, just the HOA's so-called compliance officer. But to my 15-year-old niece, Lacey, standing barefoot at the gate with a towel clutched around her, he may as well have been the law. It was a summer afternoon, hot enough that the asphalt shimmered. Kids had been laughing near the diving board, splashing, the sound of chlorine and sunlight mixing like any ordinary day, until his voice stopped everything. "Community rules," he barked, loud enough for everyone to hear. "No exceptions, even for minors." The words didn't even sound human. They sounded rehearsed, like lines from a manual. I looked at Lacey. Her swimsuit was a plain one-piece, the same style her mother used to buy for her every summer. Nothing revealing, nothing inappropriate. But her face was flushed red, not from the sun. This was shame. She looked at me, eyes darting like a trapped bird, hoping I'd step in. "I did. I'm her guardian," I told him, keeping my voice steady. "And unless you're actual law enforcement, you don't get to bark orders at a child." The gate creaked in the breeze, half open between us. For a moment, no one moved. His hand rested on the latch like he owned it, like he owned us. "Compliance is enforceable within this district," he said finally, chin raised. "If you've got a problem with that, take it up with the board." I stared at him long enough that I could hear the faint buzz of cicadas in the oak trees beyond the fence. I wasn't flinching, because I don't take things up with boards. I take them up in courtrooms, federal ones if I have to. He didn't know that yet, but I could see the smirk falter just slightly. Power shifts fast when someone realizes you're not as small as they thought. "My name's Daniel Greer," I said, "civil rights attorney, juvenile protections, and my brother's a family court judge." I leaned just enough for him to hear the weight behind it. "But today, I'm just a man keeping a promise." The silence around us was heavy, like a breath held too long. Then, slowly, he stepped back and let her through. I didn't gloat, I didn't answer him at all. I just wrapped an arm around Lacey's shoulders and walked her straight to the car. The towel was still pressed against her chest like a bandage. She didn't speak on the drive home. Not a word. Her fingers trembled at the edges of the fabric, the kind of trembling you try to hide because you don't want anyone to notice how much you're shaking inside. When we got back, she went straight to the shower. I sat on the porch swing, the one my sister painted years ago when she still had the strength to hold a brush. The teal stripes were faded now, but in the dark they whispered of summers gone, of barbecue smoke, of music and laughter, of protection. She joined me later, her hair wet, her eyes rimmed red. She sat quietly before she finally whispered. "He made me stand there while he yelled about modesty. He told the lifeguard to watch until I changed." I turned to her slowly, holding my voice steady even though my chest was burning. "You did nothing wrong." She nodded, but it was empty, like she couldn't quite believe me. She was unraveling quietly on the swing her mother once built. That pool pavilion had been sacred ground. My sister taught her to swim there. We held her last birthday barbecue there before cancer stole her from us. After she passed, I promised I'd keep Lacey tethered to everything her mother loved, this neighborhood, this porch, that pool. And now it had become a place of shame. "She was watching too," Lacey murmured. "Who?" I asked. "Marlene from the board." She didn't say anything. That landed hard. Marlene Ortiz, the treasurer, a mother herself, always quiet, always uncomfortable during votes. She stood there, saw it happen, and said nothing. "I'm not going back there," Lacey whispered. Not angry, not dramatic, just broken, like she was grieving something she had just lost. I stood and walked her towel down to the bin at the bottom of the steps. I couldn't throw it in. Instead, I folded it once more and set it gently on the lid like it mattered. Because it did. The issue wasn't just a rule. It wasn't just the man. It was the power they thought they had over our children, the silence they counted on from us. As the street lamps buzzed on and the night settled over the rows of identical houses, I found myself staring out and wondering how many parents had stood on porches just like mine, telling themselves it wasn't worth the fight. I knew one thing, that silence, it ends here. The letter came the next morning. A glossy envelope slid halfway under my door, stamped with the HOA's logo like a warning label. I carried it to the kitchen table with my first cup of coffee. The steam curled in the light of an early sun, and before I even tore it open, I knew what it was. Inside, a fine, $500, disruptive behavior at a shared amenity. Highlighted beneath it, a clause I'd never seen before, failure to enforce dress code compliance for minors. No mention of Hensley, no acknowledgement of what he had done to Lacey. Just the HOA doubling down, rewriting the story so it looked like I was the problem, like she had been the problem. I read it once, twice, a third time. By the fourth, I wasn't even reading anymore, I was studying. Watching the angles of their words like they were weapons. This wasn't just a letter, it was strategy. They wanted it official before I could challenge the narrative. When Lacey came downstairs, hair still damp from her morning shower, she didn't ask about the letter. She didn't have to. Her eyes lingered on it for a beat before she grabbed an apple from the counter and muttered, "I've got online class at 9. Her voice was flat, tired. A 15-year-old shouldn't sound like that. "You okay?" I asked. "I'm fine." She was, and we both knew it. After she disappeared into her room, I pulled out a notepad and started making calls. Neighbors I trusted, and one I barely knew but had seen at every meeting for the past 2 years. I asked simple questions. Ever notice anything strange at the pool? Did your kids mention the HOA security being overzealous? The stories didn't take long to surface. One mother told me her son had been forced to sit out for wearing a swim shirt with a slogan. Another said her daughter was sent home for showing her shoulders. A third, quieter than the rest, admitted her teenage boy stopped going entirely after Officer Hensley barked at him to pull up his trunks like a gentleman. They all used the same words to describe him: strict, creepy, too much. But none of them had filed anything. Most didn't want trouble. A few said they didn't think anyone would care, but someone always cares. By noon, I had 4 pages of notes scrawled in ink. I sat on the porch swing again, watching the HOA maintenance truck crawl down the street, slow as syrup. The driver glanced my way but didn't wave, just kept moving. I knew what they wanted: isolation, silence. They used rules like sandbags, piling them on until people stopped fighting, but they had made a mistake. The moment they fined me for what Hensley did, they made it administrative. And administrative meant records, paper trails, legal doors opening where they thought none existed. What I needed now was pressure, not on me, on them. By 3 that afternoon, I headed to the South Park, one of the few spots not directly under HOA patrol. I knew the moms gathered there, knew they might talk if the air felt safe. They did, one by one, quiet at first, then louder, until their words spilled like water through a crack. Hensley told my daughter she looked like she was asking for attention. My son waits until the guard isn't looking before he dives. They won't let my niece in without shorts, even with a one-piece. I didn't interrupt. I just listened, jotting notes as the sound of swings creaked behind us and kids played like they didn't know they were being watched. And then I noticed her. Marlene Ortiz, the treasurer, standing near the benches pretending to scroll her phone, watching, listening, not speaking. She met my eyes once. I gave a small nod. She didn't nod back, but she didn't leave either. By sundown, I had 6 testimonies in writing, 1 anonymous, 2 with full names, and more importantly, a pattern. This wasn't one bad incident. It was a policy, unwritten, but enforced by a man with a badge and no boundaries. I walked home under the flicker of HOA street lamps. Every house was identical, every porch polished, every hedge trimmed. A neighborhood built on sameness, compliance, and silence. But peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of justice, and I was done waiting for someone else to deliver it. Tomorrow, I'd find out exactly who had hired Hensley, under what authority, and whether he even had the right to stand at that pool gate in the first place. The board wanted a paper trail. Fine, I'd give them one, only this time it would lead straight back to them. The HOA office didn't look like much from the outside. Just another beige building tucked behind manicured hedges, with glass panels that reflected the Florida sun like polished shields. But I knew what waited inside. A machine built on silence, signatures, and fine print. I pushed the door open, and the small bell above it chimed. The air smelled faintly of toner and lemon polish. Behind the divider sat the receptionist, a woman who barely glanced up from her computer. "You here to appeal a violation?" she asked, voice flat, rehearsed. "No," I said, setting a dated document on the counter. "I'm here for a list of personnel files, all current security contractors, including Officer Brian Hensley." Her head snapped up, not much, but enough. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Marlene Ortiz. She wasn't in the front office. She sat just behind the divider, posture straight, eyes glued to the HOA spreadsheet on her screen. Her fingers hovered stiffly above the keyboard, not typing. When she looked up, her gaze caught mine for a fraction of a second. Then she broke it quickly, like a pane of glass flexing before a storm. "You'll need to submit that request in writing," the receptionist said. "I already did," I replied, sliding the paper closer. "Under Florida Sunshine Law, and under the HOA's own charter, Section 7.4, Nonprofit Transparency Clause." The silence that followed wasn't casual. Marlene's fingers froze above her keys. The receptionist took the document without another word. "We'll get back to you," she muttered. I turned, walking toward the door. But as I passed the framed photo on the wall, the board smiling under a ribbon at the pool pavilion, I caught Marlene's reflection. Her mouth was tight, her shoulders rigid. She didn't move, but her eyes followed me all the way out. That flicker was enough. Something was stirring behind her quiet. Later that day, the humidity hung heavy, clouds bruising the sky. I drove to Lacey's school to drop off a lunch she'd forgotten. The air outside the main office smelled of wet mulch and asphalt warming under the storm's weight. I heard footsteps, heels on concrete. "Daniel." I turned Marlene. Her blouse was crisp, but her eyes were soft around the edges, the kind of tired that comes from a conscience that won't let you sleep. "I saw your request," she said, voice low. "You're serious." "I am." Her hand tightened around the strap of her purse. She looked down. "What he did at the pool, I was there." I didn't speak. I let the silence do its work. "I didn't agree with it," she whispered. "I didn't vote for the new code last quarter either, but I didn't stop it. I told myself if I kept my head down, I could soften things behind the scenes." She blinked fast, shaking her head. But when I saw her standing there, wrapped in that towel, it didn't feel soft. It felt like complicity. Her voice broke on that last word. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. This was from last month's agenda planning. It didn't make it into the formal notes. I opened it carefully, typed lines, one section highlighted in pink. "Security should address teen dress code breaches on site immediately. Physical relocation may be used if needed to preserve community standards." I looked up at her. "I didn't write that part," she said quickly, "but I didn't delete it either." The storm clouds above us groaned. A bell rang, sharp, echoing across the courtyard as students spilled out of the halls. Lacey waved from across the lawn, a fragile smile flickering on her face, the first I'd seen in days. When we got home, I slid Marlene's note into my growing folder of evidence. Proof, not just of misconduct, but of intent, and intent mattered. That evening, the porch swing creaked under my weight. The towel was still folded on the bin lid. Lacey passed behind me on her way to the kitchen. She paused just long enough to whisper, "You're going to fix this, aren't you?" I didn't answer. She didn't need me to. 2 days later, the retaliation began. It started at dawn with a courtesy email. Timestamp, 7:04 a.m. subject line, notice of escalated noncompliance. I read it standing at the counter, coffee still steeping, the sun not yet over the trees. The violation, failure to respond respectfully to HOA authority figures. Another fine, $250. By the time Lacey came downstairs, my phone buzzed twice more. One was a text from Len, a neighbor whose patio had suddenly been flagged for a permit violation. The other was from Marlene herself. They're moving fast. I didn't approve that notice. Colleen's consolidating votes. Colleen Merrick, HOA president. If Hensley was the muscle, she was the firewall. I stepped outside for air, and that's when I saw him. Not Hensley, someone new. Another uniformed officer standing across the street with arms folded. Not writing notes, not holding a clipboard, just watching our driveway. It wasn't illegal, but it was intentional pressure, a reminder of who they thought was in control. I drew in a slow breath and went back inside. My porch light buzzed faintly above me, and for the first time I noticed the dust clinging to my boots. Small things, but they reminded me I was still grounded, still standing. That morning, I didn't read the HOA bylaws as a neighbor anymore. I read them as legal counsel preparing for discovery. And what I found was simple. There was no clause for disruption of order. They were inventing violations, hopping to provoke me, hopping to break me. But I don't break easy. The county clerk's office was a squat beige building, hidden between a courthouse and a pawn shop that smelled faintly of cigarettes and old brass. Inside, the air was cool, humming with the low buzz of fluorescent lights. I filed a Freedom of Information request at the counter. The clerk, a sharp-eyed woman named Patris, looked at me over her glasses. "That's a lot of paper you're asking for." I smiled thinly. Good thing I like paper. It took hours. I sifted through vendor payments, landscaping invoices, pool maintenance receipts. Pages of ordinary expenses, carefully cataloged to look routine. And then finally, I found it. The security contract. My pulse quickened as I scanned the header. Merrick Property Compliance Services, LLC. Not a licensed security firm, not bonded, not certified, just a shell company with a name that sounded official. Owned by none other than Colleen Merrick's cousin. I flipped through the pages, each line more damning than the last. Vague terms like community enforcement and visual deterrence. No licensing numbers, no liability insurance. And then there he was, Brian Hensley, listed as site supervisor. No credentials, no training, nothing. Just a name typed neatly into a contract that pretended to give him authority. I leaned back in the chair, the old vinyl groaning beneath me. Outside, the clouds pressed heavy against the sky. My reflection in the clerk's glass partition looked sharper, harder than usual. This was bigger than fines, bigger than one man at a pool gate. If I exposed this, the liability wouldn't just be moral, it would be financial. Insurance carriers revoke coverage fast when minors are involved with unlicensed personnel, and once that happened, the board would be exposed to personal lawsuits. I scanned the contract page by page, uploaded everything to a secured drive, then printed backup copies for a binder. When I left, the air outside smelled of wet pavement, a storm rolling in. I called someone I hadn't spoken to in months. Laura Jensen, former colleague, now senior legal advisor with the State Department of Regulatory Oversight. She picked up on the second ring. "I've got something," I said. "An HOA, a minor, and an unlicensed security contractor operating under a fake compliance umbrella." She didn't even hesitate. "Send everything." By nightfall, the report was in motion. Not a lawsuit, not yet. This was higher, regulatory. The kind of investigation that didn't need a courtroom to start shaking foundations. When I closed my laptop, Lacey was sitting on the couch with a textbook open in her lap. She wasn't reading. Her eyes kept flicking to my screen. "Did they do it again?" she asked quietly. "No," I said, "but they're going to wish they hadn't done it the first time." Her shoulders eased a fraction, not a smile, but something softer, relief. I stepped outside for air. The porch swing creaked under me. Across the street, the officer who had been standing there before was gone. The silence felt heavier than his presence. Like intimidation didn't need a body, it just needed the shadow of one. Let them escalate, let them push. Every step they took was building their own case against them, and I was holding the receipts. 2 days later, I met Laura in a diner halfway between Brookhaven Trails and the district office. The kind of place where coffee never stopped pouring and the waitstaff called everyone Hun. She was already on her second cup when I slid into the booth. "I went through the contract," she said before I even sat down. "You weren't exaggerating. Merrick Property Compliance isn't registered with the State Board of Private Security, not even close." I leaned back, listening as the rain tapped against the window. "No training, no certification, no insurance," she continued. "And they're sending this guy after kids with a badge he probably bought online." Her words were blunt, but her eyes burned with quiet anger. "That alone," she said, "could trigger a cease and desist, but the bigger exposure is insurance. If the HOA knowingly hired unlicensed personnel, their coverage could be suspended. One major claim and they're bankrupt." I nodded. We'd both seen it happen before. Quiet little boards who thought they were untouchable, only to collapse when someone pulled the right thread. "But here's the catch," Laura added, leaning closer. "Regulators don't move on documents alone. They need cause, a complaint, and not from you, from a resident, from a parent." Her meaning sank in like a weight. "You want me to file on Lacey's behalf? You're her legal guardian. You've got standing. If you file, I can activate a preliminary review under Child Public Safety Clause 82. Clause 82, I knew it well. It meant no public hearings, no drawn-out courtroom battles, just a quiet surgical shutdown, compliance teams showing up unannounced, contracts seized, licenses checked. I exhaled slowly. "I'll file." After she left, I stayed in the booth a while, staring out at the rain streaking down the glass. Filing meant putting Lacey's name on a form that would follow her into records. It meant choosing exposure over protection. And yet, wasn't that the point? When I finally drove home, the storm had passed. The streets glistened with puddles that mirrored the broken clouds. Lacey was at the kitchen table, sketching in her notebook. She looked up as I entered, pencil frozen mid-line. "Was that the lawyer lady?" I nodded. "She's going to help us." Lacey didn't ask for details. She just went back to shading her drawing. Something underwater, coral towers twisting into spires. She added one more spiral, then set her pencil down. "We need to file a complaint," I said softly. Her hand froze again. "Only if you're okay with it." "What happens if I do?" she asked. "Then I keep pushing, but slower, less direct, and he probably stays on the job longer." Her eyes dropped back to the page. She traced a line, then pressed her palm flat over it. Finally, she whispered, "Do it. Use my name. I don't want to be scared to swim." That night, I filled out the form. I didn't frame it with rage, just facts. A minor confronted by an unlicensed agent, forced to comply with a rule that didn't exist. Retaliation when challenged. I attached everything. Violation letters, the contract, board notes, Marlene's memo. At 10:32 p.m., I hit submit. By morning, a confirmation email sat in my inbox. A review had been opened, an investigator assigned, and the board, they had no idea the countdown had already begun. The confirmation email came on a Tuesday afternoon. Subject line, preliminary review initiated, CPS Clause 82. I opened it in my home office, blinds half closed against the Florida sun. The words were plain, bureaucratic, but the weight behind them was heavy. An investigator had been assigned. All involved parties would be contacted within 5 business days. And one line in bold at the bottom, "Do not disclose this review to suspected violators." It was happening. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slow. Outside, oak shadows stretched across the street like bars. Across the way, a new security officer, young, sunglasses too big for his face, made the rounds with a clipboard. He looked everywhere but saw nothing. I shut the blinds. This wasn't over, not even close. That night, I pinned everything I had to the wall above my desk. Photos of the pavilion, copies of violation letters, the shell contract, Marlene's memo, and in the center, a simple chart of the HOA hierarchy, Colleen's name bold at the top. There was still one thing missing, proof of knowledge. It wasn't enough to show Hensley was unlicensed. I needed to prove the board knew and chose to let him confront minors anyway. That was the nail that would hold everything in place. I called Marlene. She answered on the second ring, voice hushed like she was hiding in her own kitchen. "You filed, didn't you?" "Yes." A pause, then, "They're already holding emergency meetings. I wasn't invited. They'll start covering tracks." "I know." "That's why I called," she said. Her voice trembled, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was resolve. "Weeks before the incident with your niece, there was an informal email chain, concerns about Hensley, comments he made, his tone with teens, especially girls." My grip on the phone tightened. "Do you still have it?" "I deleted mine, but Len might not have." Len, alternate board member. Quiet, old school, the kind of man who kept everything. "2 blocks from you," she added. "Rust-colored mailbox, porch garden. He won't talk to me, but he might talk to you." The next morning, I walked down the street under a sky buzzing with cicadas. Len's house was shaded by vines, porch crowded with tomato plants and clay pots. He opened the door after a long pause, peering through the screen with sharp, narrowed eyes. "You know who I am?" I said. "I know what you're doing," he replied. "Good, then you know why I'm here." He stared at me for a long second, then stepped aside. Inside smelled of lemon cleaner and old books. He led me to a cluttered den, fired up an ancient laptop, and began typing with 2 fingers. "She told me you'd come," he muttered. "Never trusted that cousin of hers. Hensley looked like a rent-a-cop in high school." A few more clicks, then he found it. An email chain 6 weeks before Lacey's incident. Board members debating Hensley's tone, his overreach, his behavior toward teens. And one line from Colleen burned into my brain. "We may need to rein Hensley in before someone files a complaint." Marlene had replied, "Not our job to micromanage paid eyes. Keep order and move forward." I stared at the screen, proof they knew, they discussed it, and they chose to do nothing. Len printed it without me asking. The paper was warm in my hand. "This stays off my name," he said. "You were never here," I answered, folding the sheet. On the walk back, the neighborhood felt different. Every identical house looked less like home and more like camouflage, hiding the same rot behind perfect lawns. I passed the pool pavilion, empty. A chain-link gate loosely locked, a closed for maintenance sign dangling crooked from a single zip tie. The water inside shimmered under the sun, untouched. There was nothing wrong with the pumps or filters. The damage was procedural, and now it was documented. That evening I added Len's printout to my binder. The keystone, they knew. They ignored it. The towel still sat on the porch bin, folded tight. Lacey saw me looking at it and said nothing. She didn't have to. The next morning, another email arrived from the HOA. Subject line, upcoming security reassessment session. A closed-door meeting, board members only. And in faded gray at the bottom, a single line, optional attendance extended to Treasurer Marlene Ortiz. It was a trap, not for her but for optics. They wanted her name on record to make it look like the board was united. She didn't go. At 8:22 a.m., she knocked on my door instead. A manila folder clutched in her hands like it was glass. "I'm ready," she said. We sat on the back patio, out of view from the street. The garden smelled of lantana and damp soil. Lacey was upstairs, quiet as ever, but her silence carried weight. Marlene opened the folder. "I didn't know what I was looking at until last night, but once I saw the contract you sent me, I remembered." Inside were 3 printouts, emails from her personal archive tucked away in a folder she had once labeled draft notes legal. Insurance, protection, for a day she hoped would never come. One email stood out, from Colleen herself. Reminder, Officer Hensley is operating under MP Compliance Services Internal SPS. If approached by residents regarding his conduct, refer them to external dispute forms only. Internal evaluation is not advised unless required by a regulatory authority. Marlene's hands shook as she pushed it toward me. She told us not to intervene, even if we had concerns. She was already preempting exposure. I read it twice, my jaw tightened. "That's obstruction of oversight," I said, "and proof she knew there were complaints." Marlene nodded, and here's the worst part. She pulled out one more sheet, a scanned photo, a checklist from a so-called training orientation, signed by Hensley, no state license. No ID, just a scrawled name beneath the words visual deterrence, on-site discipline. They ran it in Colleen's garage, she whispered. It wasn't professional, it was performance. That sealed it. They hadn't just looked the other way. They had built the illusion of authority, manufactured it, sold it to the neighborhood as law. Marlene sat back, her shoulders finally sagging after weeks of quiet tension. "Why now?" I asked gently, though I already knew. She looked at the porch swing, the one her daughter used to sit on when she came by for study group with Lacey. "Because my daughter starts swim team next season, and if this happened to her," her voice broke, "I'd never forgive myself." I slid the documents into my binder. Everything we needed to nail this down had just arrived, from the one person inside the machine who still had a soul. That night the swing creaked as I sat under the fatting sky. The towel was still folded. Lacey stepped outside, sketchbook in hand. "Was that her?" she asked. I nodded. "She gave us what we needed." Lacey's eyes flicked to the street. The patrol cart wasn't there tonight, just silence. "They know," she whispered. "Not yet. But they would." By Thursday morning, I finally had a plan. Not a vague hope, not a reactive scramble, a plan. On my desk sat a binder. Heavy. Color-coded tabs dividing every piece of the puzzle. Licensing violations, internal correspondence, witness statements, retaliatory fines. At the center, Colleen's name circled in ink. This wasn't about removing Hensley anymore. That was already in motion. The real goal was structural collapse. If the board had violated the scope of their authority, every fine, every policy, every intimidation they'd passed under that fraud could be challenged. I called Laura. We spoke over a secure line. She walked me through how the CPS Clause 82 team would structure their review. "If you want a decisive outcome," she said, "you'll need public alignment, something undeniable. If the neighborhood, on record first, the board won't be able to twist the narrative." That's when I made the next move. I reserved the townhouse event hall just outside the HOA gate. Neutral ground, no security, no intimidation. The date, the following Wednesday evening. By 3:00 p.m., I had printed a dozen formal invitations. Neutral language, community legal forum, informational session regarding HOA procedural oversight and child safety protections. No names, no blame, just facts. That night, Marlene helped me slip them into mail slots, hand them quietly to parents at pickup, leave them folded between porch flyers. She didn't say much, but her presence was proof enough. Later, we sat at her kitchen table. It smelled faintly of toasted almonds, a candle flickering between us. Upstairs, her daughter laughed softly with Lacey, the kind of easy laughter that had been missing for weeks. "I found something else," Marlene said. She slid a worn notebook across the table. "Colleen used to keep this in the board's file drawer. She never shared it digitally. I took photos when no one was around." I flipped it open, a behavioral incident log, handwritten. 2 entries tied to Hensley. July 3rd, incident at Pavilion W/minor female. BH said resolved on site. No further action. August 9th, verbal warning issued. Ray dress code pushback. Treasurer objected. No action taken. It wasn't just evidence. It was corroboration, unprompted, independent, predating everything I already had. I looked at her across the candlelight. "You realize this puts you out of the shadows." She nodded. "If the ship going down, I'd rather be the one pulling nails than the one sitting silent." Her voice was steady. For the first time since this began, she looked free. When I walked home that night, the neighborhood was unusually quiet. No music from the park. No carts humming the rounds, just stillness. They knew something was coming. They just didn't know how organized it was. On the porch swing, Lacey was waiting, sketchbook balanced on her lap. She didn't look up as I sat, just kept shading the outline of what looked like a broken tower beneath the sea. "They're starting to talk," I told her. "Good." One word, but her voice carried more weight than a whole speech. The next few days were all preparation. Every document was backed up twice. A digital drive, a physical binder, each tab labeled in red ink. On Monday, Laura called again. "They've received your supplemental materials," she said. "The preliminary findings justify an in-person audit. They'll be on site by the end of the week. Until then, enforcement actions against minors are frozen." "How soon before that becomes public?" I asked. "Depends, but if you go public first, you'll set the tone." That was all I needed. On Tuesday night, I printed the agenda for the forum. No names, no finger-pointing, just bullet points, dress code enforcement, oversight suppression, security contracting procedures. At the bottom, in small italicized type, "For the protection of minors involved, video or audio recordings are not permitted." It wasn't just about Lacey anymore. By then, other families had come forward too, quietly. Notes left at my door, whispers at the park. A mother confessing her son hadn't swum in months. A father admitting his daughter quit the team after being humiliated at the gate. Every story folded into the binder. Every silence cracked open. That evening, I stepped onto the porch. The air was heavy, holding its breath. Across the street, the security patrol cart sat empty, clipboard on the seat. A blinking light on the dash, no officer in sight. A hollow show of force. Inside, Lacey flipped through the binder for the first time. She paused at the violation letter. Her fingers hovered above the yellow highlighted clause. "This still makes me feel sick," she whispered. "It should," I said. "They wanted it to make you feel powerless, but it didn't." She didn't answer, but she didn't close the binder either. That night, I typed out the final line of my opening remarks for the forum. "You're here because something crossed a line, and silence is no longer an option." I placed the draft on the porch swing, beside the folded towel that had become our marker of defiance. The cicadas hummed in the oaks, louder than the hum of any patrol cart. The neighborhood was waiting. So was I. The event hall smelled faintly of varnished wood and coffee from an old machine in the corner. Rows of folding chairs lined the space, their metal legs scraping softly against the floor as neighbors shuffled in. By 6:30 p.m., the room was half full. Some parents still in work clothes, others clutching folded lawn chairs as if they didn't trust the ones provided. Their faces were cautious, guarded, the kind of expressions people wear when they're not sure if they've made a mistake by showing up. By 6:57, the last chair scraped back. No sign of Colleen, but two board members sat in the back row whispering to each other, eyes scanning the crowd like hunters waiting for a misstep. They didn't take handouts, didn't sign in, just watched. I stood at the front of the room. A small folding table held the binder closed neatly on top. Nothing projected on the walls, no microphone. I didn't need theatrics. I needed clarity. "Thank you for coming," I began, voice low, steady. "This isn't a rebellion, it's not a vote, it's an airing of fact. You're here because something crossed a line, and I promised someone I wouldn't let it happen quietly." The room stilled. Even the hum of the AC seemed to fade. I opened the binder, slowly, carefully, the first page, dates and times of violations. I read them without dramatics, just words on paper. Next tab, contract details. Merrick Property Compliance Services, not licensed, not insured, not legal. I laid out the paper trail like laying bricks. Then the log, handwritten entries signed by board members. Records of incidents brushed aside, proof that they knew, proof they chose to ignore it. I read aloud Colleen's own words from the emails. Internal evaluation not advised unless required by a regulatory authority. When I finished, I closed the binder. The silence that followed pressed hard against the walls. "You may think this only matters to a few families," I said, voice steady. "But when unlicensed personnel are hired to confront children, when minors are humiliated under fabricated rules, every property in this neighborhood becomes a liability. Every family here is at risk." That word, liability, shifted something. A man near the side leaned forward, eyes locked on the chart I'd shown. A woman in the middle began scribbling notes. And then I told them about Lacey, Not her name, not details that would expose her, but enough. A child forced to cover up under the watch of a man with no credentials. A child turned away from a pool that was meant to be her safe place. They wanted her silent, I said softly, but she is. The room stayed quiet for a long moment, and then a voice broke through. My daughter stopped going to the pool last summer, a woman near the front said, her voice trembling. She never told me why, just said she didn't feel safe anymore. Now I know. She didn't sit down. An older man stood. My grandson was warned for wearing basketball shorts too low on his way to the pool. He wouldn't leave his room for 2 days. The air shifted. One voice became two. Two became five, stories layered over each other like threads weaving into a net. And then from the middle of the crowd, a hand raised. Marlene. She didn't walk to the front, didn't try to make a speech. She just stood where she was, voice steady. I was part of the board, I saw the directives, I didn't stop them, and I regret that more than anything. Someone clapped, not applause, a signal, others followed. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough. The 2 board members in the back stood abruptly. They didn't speak, didn't argue, they just left, quietly, heads down. By 8:00, the forum had become something else. Not just neighbors venting, but a community connecting lines. They saw the structure that had pressed against them for years. The quiet rules, the quiet fines, the quiet pressure. And now, exposure. As the crowd began to thin, one father lingered at the door. He turned back to me, voice low. I never thought anyone could crack them, he said. I didn't, I replied. They did it to themselves, I just held up the mirror. He nodded once and left. When the last chair was stacked, only Marlene remained, folding stray papers with careful hands. You did what none of them expected, she said. They gave me no choice, I answered. Outside, the night was clear, the sky heavy with stars. The air smelled of cut grass, damp earth, and something else, something older, like a page turning after sitting too long in the dark. Tomorrow the regulators would arrive, but tonight the silence had already broken. They came on a Friday morning. No warning, no banners, just 2 state vehicles pulling quietly into the HOA office lot while most neighbors were still brewing coffee. I stood on my porch, binder tucked under my arm, as the investigators stepped out. Dark suits, ID badges clipped to their belts, their shoes crunching against the gravel like punctuation. Across the street, the patrol cart idled empty. The clipboard still sat on the seat, abandoned. Inside the office, Colleen's voice carried through the glass panels before the door even shut. Sharp, defensive, but the investigators didn't flinch. They moved like people who had walked into 100 offices just like this one. They asked for contracts. They asked for personnel records. They asked for credentials. And when those things couldn't be produced, the silence was louder than her excuses. By noon, the security contract had been suspended. Hensley was officially barred from any enforcement role. By dusk, the state had frozen all discretionary enforcement actions pending review. For the first time in months, the neighborhood felt still. No violation slips tucked into mail slots, no patrols loitering at the pool gate, just quiet. That evening I walked past the pavilion. The chain-link gate stood open, its lock dangling loose. The water inside shimmered with reflected sky, still untouched but no longer forbidden. Lacey walked beside me, her sneakers brushing the concrete. She hadn't been back here since that day. She stopped at the gate, fingers curling around the cold metal. You don't have to go in, I said softly. She looked at me, eyes steady. I want to. We stepped inside. The pool deck smelled faintly of chlorine and damp stone. The water rippled in the breeze, catching the fatting light like shards of glass. She set her sketchbook on a chair, slipped off her shoes, and walked barefoot to the edge. For a long moment she just stood there, toes gripping the cool tile, staring at the surface. Then, without a word, she jumped. The splash cracked through the silence, echoing off the pavilion walls. Water rose, fell, and settled again. Lacey surfaced, hair slicked back, eyes wide and alive. She laughed, not forced, not nervous, a real laugh, the sound I had been waiting for since that awful day. I sat on the deck, binder resting beside me, and let the moment wash over. It wasn't just about contracts, or fines, or liability. It was about dignity, about a child reclaiming what should never have been taken from her. The next week, letters went out, formal notices. Colleen was removed pending investigation. Marlene reluctantly was named interim chair until a new election could be held. The community wasn't cheering in the streets, but there was relief. The kind that shows in longer conversations on sidewalks, in neighbors who finally wave again, in kids splashing at the pool without glancing over their shoulders. One evening, Marlene stopped by with her daughter. She stood awkwardly on the porch, holding a casserole dish, as if the gesture could patch months of silence. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said quietly, "but I wanted to thank you for pulling me out of the shadows." I didn't answer right away. The porch swing creaked beneath me, cicadas humming in the oaks. "Sometimes," I said finally, "the strongest thing isn't standing tall. It's admitting when you were sitting down too long." Her eyes softened. She nodded once, then turned to leave. Days passed, life crept back to normal or something close to it. Violation slips stopped arriving. The empty patrol cart vanished. The air no longer carried the weight of suspicion. But one thing stayed. The towel, still folded on the porch bin, a reminder of the day everything changed. One evening, Lacey picked it up. She unfolded it slowly, running her fingers over the faded fabric. "Should I put it away?" she asked. I shook my head. "Keep it, not as a wound, as proof." She nodded. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in bruised colors. She sat beside me on the swing, towel across her lap, sketchbook balanced on her knees. She began to draw again, this time not a broken tower beneath the sea, but a pool, clear, open, filled with figures diving without fear. I watched her hand move across the page, shading light into water. For the first time, the silence between us didn't feel heavy. It felt whole. And in that moment, I knew the fight had been worth it. Because sometimes, justice doesn't arrive with fanfare or vengeance. Sometimes it arrives in small victories. A gate left unlocked, a laugh rising from deep water, a child no longer afraid to claim her space. The kind of victories that remind you, home is not just where you live, it's where your dignity is safe. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.